And here I'm going to do the shirt collar, again, not fusing directly onto the fabric. And I want to just do maybe a few differences from the first time we did it. The main reason is that this is now my last piece of solution. It's now done, and I actually don't have another supplier. The supplier of the silicia has closed, and I don't really know where I'll find it again, but I'll keep searching. That's neither here nor there. Um, so, if you don't have silicia, or if you need to make another plan, this is what we're going to do. So we've got our fabric here. There's the collar stand, 2 pieces, and here's the collar 4, 2 pieces. So that's the fabric that we're going to be doing. Then we've got the collar 4. Now usually I would do 1 silicia and then 1 layer of fusing with the corner double fused. But now I just took a regular piece of cotton, just a nice thin cotton, and I fused 2 layers of the fusing, and I didn't do the corner because now we have 2 layers, so it's stiff enough at the corner, I feel. But of course you can put as many layers, just whatever kind of shape you want there. The important part just being that you want the fabric between the fusing and your fabric. You don't want to have a chance of this glue getting onto your fabric. So yeah, instead of using silicia, I just use a bit of fabric at the end of the day. Then for the collar stand, there's this piece of silicia that I'll use on the one end, the bigger one. And then instead of cutting this exact shape out with the silicia like I usually do, I've cut the shape out with the fusing and fused that onto a regular piece of cotton. So what I'm going to do now is just cut out these shapes. So I've got my collar 4 and my collar stand shaped exactly like I want. And so here I've cut it down to that final shape of my collar stand. That's step number 1. Also, of course, check symmetry. Make sure that these are nice to perfect. If this piece here isn't symmetrical, that's not going to kill anyone because this is all in the seam allowance. But these 2 shapes must be symmetrical. Number 2, with the fabric side facing your fabric, we're going to stitch that on. And you can see here, I've stitched down at the bottom, turn it over, and then you stitch along the top edge so that you can just shift it smoothly with your fingers to make sure there's no bubbling here. You don't want to pull it too tight so that it ends up curling, but you just want to make sure that that is 100% smooth. And step 3 is, of course, to trim. So here you can see I've got a centimeter. Here the centimeter is included. There's a centimeter going all the way around to the bottom, and here I've got 1.5 centimeters. Now this, I'm going to cut both pieces of my fabric one time, because why not? Of course you can cut them apart, but at the end of the day, these 2 shapes must be exactly the same. So I may as well cut them one time. Here at the top, I'm going to just give it maybe 1 mil of fabric. Cutting, so exciting. And here I've got my 1 centimeter. And from there, we cut this down portion. So here we need at least a centimeter, but really not more than 2. So I think I've just left mine at 1.5. Here I'm not being too cautious because we are going to trim this down again. There it is. Alright, that's trimmed. I may as well find my center while I'm at it. Just notch that in. And then the second piece of fabric, so obviously that's the right side, so on the wrong side, I want to do my silicia. So here I'll again stitch around and then just trim it down again. So I'm going to do that. here I'm just going to pin this so that it doesn't shift around too much. Okay, I'm going to be stitching that. And then collar 4, same story. Trim down to your final shape, which includes my 1 centimeter seam allowance here that's going to go into the seam. Check symmetry. Stitch onto the fabric with the fabric side facing to this fabric side, so that the glue is now on this side and there's a barrier between that and the fabric. I stitch this side in the seam allowance because that we can then just leave there, we don't have to unpick it. Shifted this side, make sure it's smooth as you go and just stitch around that. Obviously this we're going to be undoing. And then lastly is to trim. Now here, all of this, we don't really need to trim because, I can just trim that later as the seam allowance. But this portion is easier to trim now. And as you know, I'm going to leave maybe a mole, maybe 2 moles, just for funsies, just so there's a little bit of layering on that level. So trim that, right sides together. And then I can go ahead and stitch. And of course, our special stitch story. So I'm just going to pin this edge. Now this is something that's very, very important, and I want to really emphasize this from the last video. So we're going to stitch here. I'm going to back tack, stitch along, and I'm not going to be right on the edge. I'm going to be about 1/4 centimeter, maybe call it 2 mils from the edge, because right on the edge there's not enough space to turn over. So about 2 mils, I'm going to go along, back tack here, and I'm going to back tack sort of across the end of my cuff here. Then what I'm going to do is bubble this so that I have a little bit of extra there, not a lot, 1/4 centimeter to 1/2 centimeter. And then again, back tack over that corner and come all the way up. So that here on the edge, we've got 2 back stitches giving us a very nice, neat corner over there. This is very important. So I'm going to go ahead and do all of that. Actually, the last video really goes through a lot of detail. So this, I'm just going to go very quickly. As you see there, some notches, iron that up. I'm going to then stitch that about 1 centimeter. For the other side of the collar stand, I've basted the selitia. No, this is the selitia, basted the selitia. This is the collar stand. And this portion I haven't trimmed. So here I trimmed it to the exact shape of the collar stand. But here I haven't trimmed it because I know I'm going to trim this down anyways. And here on the edges, I've stitched, also this one, I've stitched so that it can be in the seam allowance. So I don't have to spend my time unpicking that. We can just leave it in the seam allowance. Now, the biggest reason that we're doing this update video is because of this situation. You see there, I've got this sort of, I don't know in English, raffle so 8. Now, there's a few reasons for that we're going to make sure we address here. One is just cutting too close to your stitching. That's actually the only real reason, but we're just going to do a few things to really avoid that. So see here, I've got my the back stitch. Now, first off, I'm not going to cut too close, but before that, I'm just going to put a little piece of soft fusing here at the back, and I'm going to go over this and stitch again. Just to give a secure stitch there that nothing's going to ruffle at. So I'm going to start about here, stitch along, I'll stop over there. Easy peasy. Let me go and do all of that. Stitched, nothing exciting happening there. Fused, and then 1 extra stitch line stitched in there. Now what I'm going to do is trim off that corner, and here I don't want to be closer than 2 mils to the corner. The rest, it's just too dangerous. The rest will fray out. And if I get closer than that, you run the risk of what I was showing you earlier, that it starts to come undone. So that's what's happening there. Then, like we said, you can, if you want, layer this. I'm not going to do that. Just going to trim that down to about a centimeter. And then I will flip this around, make sure that all the seam allowance is towards the back portion. So let's see, I'll flip this around. I'll be using my knitting needle, and I'll make sure that my seam allowance is behind, and I'll make sure that when I iron it, the seam is just tucked a little bit underneath. This is why we need to be maybe 2 mils away from the edge when we stitch here, so that there's enough fabric to stretch around and come to the underside. So that's basically all the new things. I'm going to carry on running through this very quickly. Turned around, ironed so that the seam is towards the back, and given it a top stitch because there has to be something holding these two together. I have sometimes thought about doing like a thin fusing along there because that, when we turn it around, the fusing will act as the stitching. But I just think top stitching is better. That's just how it goes. So I've done that. Now, as you know, I'm going to squeeze this just a little bit towards the back, just that lifts that tiny little bit. Pin that. Going to do that all the way around, and then just do a top stitch over there within the seam allowance so that it's going to be hidden inside the seam allowance. So there it is. Did my top stitch there. So now I'm going to take right side or outside facing up. This portion is the piece that's against the neck. So in a way, the inside. Forgot I need to do just a few little notches here and there, just to make it a bit easier for me. Something also I forgot to talk about is, of course, check for symmetry and mark the center. Just going to give it a little bit of a tug. Put this towards the inside, matching up my center. And I'm a pinner, love to pin, 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 pin. So I'm just going to go around and do that, going from the center out. All right, there we are. And the other direction. I suppose you could do this just by stitching, but you know me, I'm a pinner, especially in bespoke. I like to pin everything and just make sure it is actually doing what I want it to do. And then check that this is going to be symmetrical. Yeah, look at that. Fashion, baby. Then I'll take my back side. So this is the part that's going to be on the outside, not touching the neck. Am I right? No, I'm confusing myself. This is the part that is touching the neck. And the other part is the part that's towards the outside. No? Let me tell you, it's a confusing life. No, I think I was right the first time. This is the part that's kind of around the outside of the collar stand, and the part that's touching the neck is this one that has the shape stitched into it. I'm pretty sure I'm right. There's a lot of flipping around happening in the collar, so don't judge me for getting a bit confused with what's what. Yeah, and of course this, we specifically cut this so the shapes are going to match. So here I can just make sure that the shapes are matching and the rest will all just fall into place. Now with a round shape like this, it can sometimes, it's difficult to match 1000%. With a square, it's a lot easier. But anyway, here we go. As long as those edges are matching and my center is matching, and when I fold it over, it's going to give me a symmetrical piece. That's totally fine. So now I can stitch 1 centimeter. I stitch maybe 2 mils outside on the outside of that. This is all 1 centimeter. And then again, same story here. And just one little trick, I'm not going to start my stitching here because then my loose threads are going to be flapping around, so it's a lost peel. I'm going to start over here, go backwards and then forwards, so that my loose threads are over here. Same here, I'm going to come to the end. I'm not going to, I'll back stitch and then I'll stop maybe about here. I'm not going to come back and leave my threads hanging around there. So that's that. Let's make it. Right, there I've given that a stitch, following around the edge there, the centimeter, etc. Then I just flip it over here and just stitch again to make sure I get a nice round edge there. And before I carry on, I'm going to flip that, just give it a bit of a press with my fingers, just here on the edges. The rest I'll do with the iron in a second, but I just want to flip that over, give that a bit of a press, and then I want to check for symmetry. Cannot check this too many times. Look at that, fashion. But you might see one is a little bit longer or a little bit higher or something like that. You should always go back and stitch that. So what I'm going to do now, I'm sure you know, so I'm going to just trim this back with a zigzag and just kind of the corner of this portion of the collar 4, just because this is quite a bulky section. So I'm just going to trim that back with a zigzag. This I don't really stress about, and then I'll give it a nice iron around like that. Here I've done the ironing. I can now do the fun unpicking of this one. If I choose, or I can leave this to the end, doesn't really matter. What I'm going to do now is my signature top stitch. It's not all that signature. I mean, well, I'm showing it on the internet. And I have seen it many times, but it did, in this specific case, really save my skin a little bit. So I'm going to mark 7 centimeters from the edge, and I'm going to do my top stitch, running with the machine foot from here up to the 7 centimeters. Then I'm going to go down to 1 centimeter, maybe 3/4 centimeters, along, back up, and then on the edge. And what happened, this particular client that I'm doing this for, I've done this job for him so many times. And as you can see at the moment, I'm doing 3 new shirts for him, or old shirts that I'm changing the collar. And he came to me with this shirt, and here you can see the bubbling problem that happens. And he was really angry that he pays quite a bit for this job to be done from us, and look at this bubbling. And he was angry. He was like, no, how can it be like this? Why is your shirt bubbling? And I was able to just look at the stitching here and immediately say, oh no, that's not our shirt. We have a signature stitch here. Here, let's look at one of the shirts we've done. I showed him one of the shirts we've done. And I said, look, I don't know who did this, but it's definitely not us because we have a signature stitch. You can spot our collars immediately. So whoever did this, please go and be angry with them. But when you walk in here, you're going to be paying. I didn't exactly say it like that, of course. I'm saying it now on the internet because here I can rant. Of course, to him, I was much more polite. But it saved my skin a little bit, having that little bit of a signature. And I also do feel that the stitch here on the edge tends to kind of flip over like that, whereas the stitch down here tends to hold it nicely in place. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and do that. After that, I'm going to go here and measure up my 1 centimeter and then trim all of this off. Then I'll rebase that and then attach it onto the shirt. Fun times. And that's done. There's my signature stitch. Just going to go around and mark a 1 centimeter here. So you can, at this stage, put your buttonhole in button. But as I've said before, I have just mistakenly put the button on the wrong side and the buttonhole on the wrong side so many times that I've kind of just given up. I rather would sew this onto the shirt first and then do the button and buttonhole just in case. So here, there's my 1 centimeter seam allowance. Okay, there we are. And you guessed it, More basting. So I'm just going to go along this. I'm not even going to bother to backstitch. There wasn't that piece of black thread there. I'm not really going to bother to backstitch because, you know, it is stitched securely here on the edges. So I'm just going to go along, baste this. Then I'm going to mark my center, and then I'll be putting it onto the shirt. So this is the shirt that I'm replacing, the collar. I've given a top stitch there, half a centimeter seam allowance, and I've marked my 1 centimeter. So now I'm just going to walk out the measuring tape and see. I need to get to 47 and a half for this chip, and I can see in the middle I'm 23 and a half, so that should give me 46, and this should give me 47 exactly. So it's better that the neck is just a little bit, no more than half a centimeter longer than the, you know, see, that gives me 46. And I need 47. So I'm going to now, let's say to myself, imagine that I cut down to this half a centimeter. Cut down to half a centimeter, and you can see this scoop here is not exactly the kind of scoop that we want. So I'm just going to bring it down, scoop it a little bit, and like that. And then remark. So that's now I'm imagining, okay, I'm going to cut there, which will mean my new seam allowance is going to be like this. So let me measure to the center. So if I'm stitching here on this new seam allowance, and get all the way to the center, that gives me 23.75, which is 26, 27 and a half exactly. So this should work. Again, I'm going to do the same here. I'm going to pretend that, okay, I cut down, I scoop that out because that's a little bit too straight. Can't have things that are too straight in this day and age. And then there's my seam allowance at 1 centimeter. Let's go all the way around. So here, cutting the neck down, you know, it's a bit of a process. You're 47, and I need 47.5. You know, that's going to be fine. The rest of it is just going to stretch out. Let's just look quickly. So if I'm looking, you know, here's the shoulders, here's the back. It should be a U like that, flat and a U. And then the front should scoop down like that. And there's the front. So in this case, this is a little bit straight here. So I can just scoop it out and that gives me a little bit extra measurement. Now, if you want to increase the length of this thing, you don't take it out all the way around. No. You first start with, you know, it depends on the measurements. You have to kind of decide. So you can take it down. You can, if you need, take it out from the side, but never further down on the back. The back must always just come to the side like that, to the side, out like that, and down. So it really depends what you're doing. Often, if this is the front, here's the back, I will just take it down on the front like that and then smooth that in like so, depending on the measurements. So with this one, you know, because we were basically okay with the measurements, I'm just taking it down by that half a centimeter of the front, and I like to do it all together because that makes sure that my symmetry remains symmetrical. You know how much I love pins. So you see, in this case, I'm not going to make the the shoulder wider there. Just going to take it down by about half a centimeter. So that's more or less where my stitching was. And then I just want to scoop this portion. Just looks a little bit too straight for me. Way too straight for my liking. And then I'm just going to do just a few very small notches just to make it a little bit easier for my collar. I'm going to make sure I maintain that center. Okay, and let's see how does the collar work. So you see there I've got my center. I put this on to the back of the shirt, starting at the yoke. Oh, something I forgot to do is to mark my stitch line. Here along the edge, the 1 centimeter. And matching from the center. Going around. Nothing too exciting, just going around and making sure that where the stitch line is at the 1 centimeter mark, there's no folds or bubbles or anything there. And then I'll just skip ahead because here I want my collar to be 1 millimeter back from the shirt, no more than that. It's just going to help it lie flat. So here, my collar is a little bit too big, but I'm actually just going to ease that excess in because at the end of the day, we're joining two very different shapes. So it is quite normal for the collar to bubble a little bit. What is too much, what is too little. This is something you can only really know through doing 1,000 collars. Oh, there we go. So something I did forget to do is to check whether the center mark of the shirt is actually center. So let me tell you, crazy things happen out there in the draw beta. I'm just going to carry on. You see, this time I'm gathering the collar just ever so slightly as I go. Again here, 1 millimeter back from the shirt, no more. Yeah, that's looking fine. There we go. So this is borderline too much, but it is in fact reasonable. So I'll keep it like that. All right. Then I'm going to go ahead and stitch along this mark, making sure that on this side I don't create any random fold. So there it is, stitched along that line. I'm going to give that an iron, then I'll iron it up and pin that along the edge and then do my top stitch. One very important thing here, tuck those corners in, and this is the only place I'll trim down just a little bit, no more than, let's say, 0.5 centimeter, just so that that can neatly tuck in there. And then make sure when we're stitching that we're not exposing those stitches there. This must 100% cover in like that, like so. We don't want to have such a situation. And here we are right at the end. So now I know where my button is, so I'm not going to F that up. I know, these are 3 centimeters high, so I want to be 1.5 centimeters. And I follow this stitch line. I want it to be parallel with that. And I do 1.25 centimeters from the edge. The buttonhole in this case is 1.5. And I'm not going to use my buttonhole foot because on something like this where there's too much seam allowance, too many variations in the thickness of the garment, it's just not going to work. So you've already moved this chap's button there. Probably move that back. But in any event, 3 centimeters. So there's my 1.5, and then 1.25 centimeters back. There's going to be my button. I'll probably just leave that one where it is. I'll see how I feel. And yeah, that is that. So those are all the new exciting tricks for making this collar without diffusing.